You want to talk about St. Louis and professional wrestling. I go back to what many wrestlers have said over countless years, and that was back in the days of Sam Muchnick and Wrestling at the Chase, and in the old days, I would dare say, of the St. Louis professional wrestling territory. When you were a part of the NWA, if you made it to St. Louis, you had made it in the industry of professional wrestling. And even when Sam Muchnick went into retirement, and you see the likes of a Larry Matisick coming on board and trying to continue on with the legacy of St. Louis wrestling, and now today, when you see so many different professional wrestling promotions that call the St. Louis area home. I mean, again, you have a lot of great history all across this country, and St. Louis has been consistently at the forefront because, as I said before, I mean, how many times can we go back and look at the NWA Missouri State Championship or the times the NWA World Heavyweight Championship would change hands here in the St. Louis metropolitan area? And again, even if you look at it today, going back to Dynamo Pro Wrestling back several years ago, having Scrap Iron Adam Pierce and the Tokyo Monster Kahagas coming here with Dynamo Pro Wrestling for an NWA World Championship matchup. That shows right then and there that the professional wrestling scene definitely knows what St. Louis is all about.
I actually worked a couple shows with Scrap Iron Adam Pierce, and he is a very solid professional. Right, worked a main event show with Mike Modest, who was with All Pro Wrestling.
One thing, Russ, when you talk about things and you talk about Adam Pierce, I had the opportunity back in 1997, back with a little promotion called the Mississippi Valley Wrestling Alliance. And to give you an idea, at the time, Adam Pierce was one of many in this area that was regularly a part of that promotion. When you have wrestlers like the likes of Adam Pierce, you have wrestlers like Adrian Lynch, you have wrestlers like Derek Stone, and some guy, I know a lot of your listeners may have heard of him, guy's name, Ace Steel. I know it's another name that's been bounced around a lot, but I mean, again, that core of individuals was regularly making the trip down from Chicago, from Wisconsin, and making that regular commute to be here. And I got to tell you, I had an opportunity just a few short days ago to talk with Adam Pierce, and do have a couple of his matches both in the MVWA and a promotion called MRW, where Adam Pierce was here in the St. Louis area. And again, when you talk about professional wrestling in St. Louis, there are so many great names that have had the opportunity to grace professional wrestling rings in the St. Louis area. And again, continues the prime legacy of St. Louis pro wrestling.
That's fantastic. Again, we're with Luke Roberts here with the Independent St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame. I think we might have gotten cut off in the first minute or so of introduction because of some technical issues, so I want to make sure people know who you are. And you're basically we've had some other historians. Who are some of the other famous St. Louis historians we've had? We've had our Barbara Goodish on here on the show. We had a couple other folks. Was it Herb Simmons, also a St. Louis guy? Blends a little bit. Help me out here, Evan.
It's all a blur. 300 plus shows in.
Thank you. Yeah, soon we're gonna.
That's very helpful.
From 350 days, we're gonna have to make a movie called 350 shows.
That's right. We're almost there.
Yeah. So, I've always, when you think of St. Louis, I think you think of two major names, at least to me, come immediately to mind. One is the original Sheik, right? Is that he was really, he did a lot in that territory. And
more Detroit than St. Louis.
Well, Detroit and St. Louis, I think, shared a lot of the same talent base. Isn't that kind of right? They had a lot of...
Sam Muchnick leaned more towards the technicians like Jack Briscoe and Dory Funk Jr. and Johnny Valentine. The Sheik wrestled everywhere. But he wasn't featured as much as the technicians.
And then Bruiser Brody did a lot of St. Louis work.
Yeah.
I really think a lot of when I think of Bruiser Brody and I think of St. Louis, I think of those two teams really merged together, those two entities really merging together. What are some of your memories of Bruiser Brody? Did you ever watch him live or watch him on TV?
Well, one of the things I look at with Bruiser Brody, and again, the two names you bring up earlier, Barbara Goodish and Herb Simmons. Interesting side note: when I first got into the wrestling industry back, and again, your viewers may find this a little bit strange, but I've been involved with professional wrestling since I was 10
They've
years
watched
old.
320 shows of us. There's really nothing that you could say that they could get is stranger than what we've done in 320 shows. Trust me, even if you put on all those masks, it's not going to be stranger. We had the Metal Maniac on our show. Let me just put it that way. You have a long way to go to reach the kind of strange that Metal Maniac put us through. But please continue, Mr. Roberts.
Well, when you look at things, though, I mean, again, you look at Bruiser Brody, and again, Bruiser Brody was very early in my time being around professional wrestling, and having the opportunity to watch Brody. Matter of fact, last night, I was sitting down to prepare for this interview tonight, and I sat
You
down
prepared?
and I watched some stuff. Yep, I actually made an attempt
We
to prepare.
didn't.
And but when I watched things, I looked at some stuff regarding the situation that happened in Puerto Rico. But I also had an opportunity to look at some stuff from World Class, and I watched a match up here in St. Louis between Ric Flair and Bruiser Brody. And a lot of people thought, oh, you have Bruiser Brody and Abdullah the Butcher, and it would just be a blood and guts fest. But the weird thing is Brody could go out there and wrestle with anybody. And he went out there with Ric Flair, I believe it was at the Checkerdome, and he tore the house down. And that was the thing that a lot of people say, oh, well, Brody, he was tough, he was opinionated. But the fact is, the man could go with anybody. And again, that shows what, I mean, when you look at St. Louis Pro Wrestling and you look at somebody like Bruiser Brody, that was a man who intimidated me. I mean, again, he was 6'6", I think he was pushing 300 pounds. He had that long flowing hair, and I mean, again, just he looked like somebody.
The big furry boots.
Exactly.
The big furry boots.
You did not want to be on the wrong side of Bruiser Brody, because you were going to wind up paying the cost.
So I
Absolutely.
saw Brody and Abdullah on an indie in New Jersey, and they're brawling through the crowd. They're both bloody. And the fans are fleeing like in a Godzilla movie because they were twice as big as the fans. So it was really like the fans were running from these guys. It was wild. And I saw Brody against Bruno in New York. People tend to forget that he came in. This is interesting. A little side note. So in 1975, 76, in New York, we had superstar Billy Graham at his peak, Ivan Koloff, Ernie Ladd, three of the greatest heels of all time. So all of a sudden, Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen come in, and they were like kids at the time, and nobody knew them here. And it was almost like, to us, it was kind of like a drop in quality until you realized, you know, these guys could really work. And then Hansen accidentally hurt Bruno, and it really put him on the map. And so I saw Bruno and Brody at Madison Square Garden, and I saw Bruno and Brody in a cage at the Nassau Coliseum. I don't think people even know that match ever happened, because, like I said, it wasn't as big a deal then. You know, it was just, you know, Brody worked the circuit with Bruno, and Bruno eventually beat him, you know, up and down the circuit. But he peaked years later, and but he was great. I mean, I saw him live multiple times, and it was, you know, I didn't see him live in the Texas era, but I regularly watched him on TV, and guy was a huge name and great.
And when you look at it too, is the idea of where, if you talk about his feud with Bruno Sammartino, if it wasn't for those matches that he had with Bruno, you don't see him go to Japan. You don't see him become such a huge name. And many people rival Brody. And again, this is going to sound strange, but Brody and Hogan. A lot of people would be Brody and Hansen, but a lot of people, based on his reputation and based on what he was capable of delivering, many people rivaled Brody to Hogan just because of the ability and how much of a reaction he gained in Japan. But again, it was the time of the territories. And once you go in, and if you can say Bruno Sammartino is on your list of people that you've competed against on a regular basis, you can write your ticket anywhere on this planet as a professional wrestler because you've taken on the best.
Back in the day, you didn't have the technology, you didn't have the internet, period. So basically, it was the Mark mags, and Bruno was on the cover of all of them, and there's Brody on the cover with Bruno. So it really helped put him on the map, that publicity in WWF. And prior to that, I was watching Brody on Florida TV as Frank Goodish. And as he was leaving the territory, he's putting these guys over. You can't imagine, much lower on the, on the pecking order than Brody would be. But, that's the way they did it back in the day. You put the guys over on the way out. So, it was, he was impressive. Even as a quote unquote kid in 1976 in WWF, the guy was impressive. And, I still have those programs, Bruno and Brody at the Garden. Yeah.
So, Luke, tell me how you got started in professional wrestling and how did you get an interest in it?
Well, the first thing is, and I'm just going to level with you, my first real inkling with professional wrestling, being a St. Louis, and you would figure it would be wrestling at the Chase, but I'm going to level. It wasn't wrestling at the Chase. I remember when I was a little 5-year-old kid, and I would get in the car with my mom and my dad on a Friday night, and we'd drive 2 hours south to a little itty-bitty hole-in-the-wall town called Piedmont, Missouri. This is before cable. This is before the internet. This is before all those kinds of things. And somehow or another, my grandmother, with the good old rabbit ear antenna, with positioning them in the right way, and again, you had to make sure it was the right kind of day. You didn't have too much of a storm. And I remember because the big thing was at 6:05 Eastern, 5:05 on the Central, you had to make it a point. My grandma had to be in her recliner. My dad was in my late grandfather's recliner. My mom was sitting on the couch, and I would remember like it was yesterday. I was sitting on the most uncomfortable, obnoxious, orange-brown shag carpet you could ever imagine. But the idea of sitting there and seeing the likes of a Thunderbolt Patterson, the likes of Ole and Gene Anderson, watching.
Was this Mid-South or was this Georgia? Was this Mid-South?
This was Georgia Championship Wrestling. And it was the idea of sitting there and watching back when you look at the idea of Ric Flair being a cousin to the Andersons, watching, and again, going back and looking at stuff in Florida and seeing the likes of Marty Lundy, who later becomes Arn Anderson, and seeing all these particular wrestlers, and then as time went on, watching the rock and rolls in the midnights. And that was one thing I always loved, was watching tag team wrestling and seeing, and again, my wife always gives me such a hard time because of really having a following, a history with one Jim Cornette. And she sits there and she has her opinion, but Jim Cornette was always one of those that struck me because I wasn't a big guy at the time. I mean, I was a 6-7-year-old kid. But the idea of where it just struck me, that was somebody who looked like me, and I wished I could have that gift of gab. And as that went on, my brother, ironically, was a much larger guy than I was. And it just happened in the St. Louis area. He met the promoter of the MMWA, which for many years was the sister promotion for Southern Illinois Championship Wrestling, run by Herb Simmons. And when he met Tony Costa, I mean, he was 5'10", pushing 450 pounds. Like, you look like a wrestler. And
5'10", 450?
It just 450 pounds. And
I'm 5'10", like 195. So that's like two of me. That's like putting two of me and then some on. That's pretty impressive.
But when you sit there and you look at it, and when he brought him in, it just kind of flowed. It went from being the fan watching with mom and dad, and then having to sit there and watch him train and watch him cutting his teeth in the wrestling industry. And then when he gets in, at first he was the sound guy, and I was helping him out. He was selling merchandise, he was selling programs, he was doing all the things he could. But the second he gets in the ring, that spot becomes open. And at 10 years old, I'm sitting there behind a table behind two fellow Hall of Famers, Herb Simmons and the late Ed Smith, who many knew here in the St. Louis area as a referee, a lot of times in the Wrestling at the Chase era, to have those two individuals just sit there and learn from them. So by the time I got in the ring at 17, I'd already seen 6-7 years of how the industry worked. And like I said, once you get that feeling, you get that rush, you get that reaction, it just goes. And I mean, again, that's what's kept me around for so long. It's just the adrenaline of being out there, hearing the crowd. You cheer for the good guy, you boo for the bad guy, and that was the hook.
So tell me about your ring experience that you had from 17. You started working at 17.
Started my in-ring career at 17, and what was crazy about it was the idea that I was not a big guy at 17. I was only about 120, 125 pounds. Cruiserweight would not have been me back then. I really didn't belong at the time. But I went in there, and I showed that I was going to go in there and wrestle with anybody. It didn't matter your size. It didn't matter the build. I mean, yeah, I came up with a whole bunch of L's in my ledger, but people started to gain respect because I went in there with guys that were 2 times my size, and I was going in there and I was trying to pull off moves that a lot of them weren't doing. I was trying to do the Ranas. I was trying to do a lot of the things like moves off the ropes, moves like trying to innovate suplexes and things like that. But being in the ring, and going through, it was kind of ironic because I was doing that and college at the same time. And just because the idea of where I went and I got my degree, and it's like, okay, I got my degree. As Dom DiNucci says in Mick Foley's book, 99% of wrestlers don't make it much past the territory days. So it's always good to have something to fall back on. But I always kind of fell back on wrestling too. And I mean, again, it just evolved from being a wrestler to being a referee to being an announcer. It was one of those things that the more you have available, the more marketable you are. It doesn't matter whether it's in the business world or the wrestling world. The more things you can do and the more knowledge that you have, the more you can contribute to the professional wrestling industry. And like I said, it just kind of evolved over time. And like I said, I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.
Speaking of trades, I always wanted to ask this question, and you're probably the guy to ask. So, Sam Muchnick in St. Louis is known for quality technical wrestling. I mean, not 100%, but for the most part, they had their brawls and everything else too. But you always think Dory Funk, Jack Briscoe, Harley Race. These great wrestlers, Ken Patera. So all of a sudden, WWF, is, tearing this path through wrestling in the 80s. And Hillbilly Jim is wrestling, Mr. Fuji in a tuxedo match in St. Louis or whatnot. How did the fans accept that? I mean, that's a huge switch and not a good one,
Well, Evan, as you bring up here, I like, in my opinion, the change of the scene of wrestling with Muchnick's retirement and the time post Larry Matisick. I liken it to when Vince McMahon managed to convince the Briscoes to sell their share in Georgia. And it was the idea of when you see it on television and you see those things, in the beginning, people were looking at it and going, this is not what we signed up for. The St. Louis area was known for being an NWA territory, a staple of the NWA community. And again, you talk about a lot of the classic wrestlers. Another one, and actually, it was one of the very few programs my brother has kept, being a historian himself. He had one where, if I'm not mistaken, it was Race, Backlund, and Rick Martel were all on the same event here in St. Louis. And you had all three major world champions were here. And I mean, again, when you see that change, it was a change for a time, but then again, you see that phenomenon that is the late Hulk Hogan. You see the Rock and Wrestling connection. You see WrestleMania 1. And people, as much as they loved the NWA, you couldn't question what was going on in professional wrestling. I mean, you sit there and you look at it and you see the likes of I mean, again, when you have the Hulk Hogan's coming in and again, the Hillbilly Jims and the Mr. Fuji's and the Roddy Pipers, who, I mean, again, was very, very prevalent at the time, especially in the mid-Atlantic territories. And it's like you said, you picked up all these different territories. And when it came down to it, if you like, okay, I'm not a Hogan guy, but I see a Roddy Piper, or I see a Warlord and a Barbarian, or if you go later on, you start seeing the Dusty Rhodes and the Ric Flairs making their movement in the late 80s, early 90s.
Let me tell you my path as a New Yorker, lifelong New Yorker, as you could tell by my accent. So this rock and wrestling thing starts, and I love Piper. Heel Piper was as exciting as anybody I've ever seen. And I love Snooker and Morocco, and these guys were great. Slaughter and the Iron Sheik with their boot camp matches. This was great. But by the late 80s, it was more circus and more for the kiddies than, in the mid 80s, it was like a mix. But you said it was worth going just to see Piper. It was worth going just to see, some of these great guys. That I was there the night Snooker jumped off the cage. Morocco. That was right before the whole Hogan thing. But my point being, by the late 80s, I pretty much stopped attending WWF, and I was going to the NWA in Philly. I was going to the NWA in Baltimore. It was worth traveling to see a superior product that was more wrestling based as opposed to sports alleged entertainment. Now, in hindsight, 40 years later, I regret not seeing more of Randy Savage, not seeing more of Bret Hart, not seeing more of Shawn Michaels, because these guys, transcended the stupid stuff that was prevalent. You miss some great stuff along the way. So, it's even today, it's all a mixed bag. Like, I watched WrestleMania. Night 1 I thought was horrific, and night 2 I basically enjoyed. So you almost have to treat it like a smorgasbord today and pick and choose what you like. And there's a lot about the AEW that I do like. I think Ospreay's best in the world, but there's some of it when they just slap 10 guys together at the last second, go out and have a match, and it's nothing but high spots. It's like it's kind of like a meaningless blur. I don't think that touches 1982 St. Louis wrestling, or
No.
yeah.
Well, one thing too, Evan, you talk about it. How about we look at the idea though too, of when you're looking at what the WWF at the time was bringing forward, they were regularly going to the arena, but you still had your diehard fans, your diehard NWA wrestling fans, not sports entertainment. I would dare say the wrestling fans, for those that are more of the southern vernacular, that would come down. And again, when you had matches at the Kiel Auditorium, I remember going back, and again, by this point in time, it was one of my first events with Starrcade 90. And again, that was near the end of the NWA days. You knew that the WCW merger and the acquisition of the NWA was going to happen shortly thereafter. But when you would go to places like Kiel Auditorium and you had that center light right there in the middle of the ring, and it was the old, I dare say, the smoky venue, the that one bright light in the center of the ring. You had the spotlight bringing in the wrestler to emphasize how big your good guy and your bad guy were.
No pyro, no video
exactly.
entrance.
Exactly. And that was one of the things in St. Louis too that made it, to me, was so unique, was the idea of, if you wanted all of the glitz and the glamour and all that kind of stuff, you could go see the WWF. But to me, I was always one of those where the NWA was where my roots were. And a little side story here, 1997, my first real big time match. I was wrestling in a tag team against two gentlemen who legitimately were military drill instructors. And at the time, I'm like a 19-year-old kid, and these guys are 30s, late 30s, early 40s. And I'm sitting there and I'm pacing up and down. And ironically, Harley Race was on that show. And I remember it like it was yesterday. He said, "You nervous, kid?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm going to probably get hurt." He's like, "Don't worry about it now. You signed the contract. You signed to be there. You're going to hurt tomorrow. But these fans paid to see what you can do in the ring." And at that point, it all made sense. And again, when you look at professional wrestling too, and you gentlemen talk about your histories and where you come from, and again, you talk about MSG, but you also, and again, I feel very fortunate, Evan, you talk about places like the Philly Spectrum, you talk about places like Baltimore, you talk about the Nassau Coliseum, you talk about these venues that are such staples of professional wrestling, and having the opportunity to travel and be at places, had an opportunity to drive by in Portland and be by places like the Rose Garden. I would have loved, and I still wish, it's on my bucket list of things to do, to go to places like San Fran, like LA, to be the Olympic Auditorium.
Come on out of here, but don't call it San Fran. We'll know you're not from here. We call it San Fran. You don't call it San Fran. You don't call it Frisco. It's SF. But anyway, and yeah, it would be great if you came to the Cow Palace. I think you'd find the Cow Palace to be filled with a lot of the legends that, and ghosts from wrestling's past out here. We'd love for you to make a tour out here sometime and check it out.
Oh, most definitely. And when you talk about professional wrestling too, and we've mentioned it earlier, there were a handful, and you always see the map of the territories, and you get the central states, and you get the big time wrestlings in the Detroit area, and you get the AWAs, and once you get out of St. Louis, you run into the WWAs with Dick the Bruiser in Indianapolis. You start running into the Mid-South territory. You run with the Goulises. You run with, again, the giant hodgepodge when you look at Texas, and you look at like the Funks, and you look at pardon me, you look at the Funks, and you look at the Von Erichs, and you look at all those different groups. But when it comes down to it, St. Louis has always held that place, has held that prestige of being a key place to say, if you've wrestled in St. Louis, it's like wrestling at Madison Square Garden, or it's like wrestling at the Armory in Tampa. You can say that you've made it somewhere when you wrestle in one of those historic towns.
Especially at the Chase. If you wrestle at the Chase, that is tantamount to being at Madison Square Garden as far as what it meant for a territory. If you did the Cow Palace here in San Francisco, then you've made it. You've wrestled in the big venue there. Now, I got to say, on a side note, I want you to talk about the St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame in a second, but I got to say, I'm a mask guy. I really dig wrestling masks. So I wanted to talk to you about your wrestling mask collection that you have up there. And you want to give us a little bit of a tour, guided tour?
Oh, most definitely. I've got a few of them here that a lot of your viewers are going to look at. Right here, as you can
Blue
tell,
Demon.
Blue Demon, probably one of the staples of Mexican lucha libre, alongside the likes of El Santo, of Mil Mascaras, of El Canek, of Dos Caras. Then, for those that are here, and I do have my little
Grappler.
side story here. Interesting note here, and I'm going to see if I can actually take care of this here. And I
And
think
did
I've
you
actually
ever wrestle in a mask when you were doing your wrestling stuff?
when I was early in my career, I did. But here's one thing I wanted to share with you. Had an opportunity here, and I'll just show it right here, breaking down some walls.
Oh yes, we've had Len Denton on the show. We've had Len.
And
That's neat. That's really cool.
and that's one of those where, I mean, again, one of the things that I absolutely love in the collection of things here. Then you go and you start talking about the likes of a Rey Mysterio, of a Dr. Wagner. You talk about Octagon. You talked about the likes of Averno. Another one I have in my collection that I actually need to put up is one of the masks from Ultimo Guerrero. And that's one of the things that you look at from professional wrestling is the idea that and actually, I was hearing some stories about the likes of the Masked Marvel, hearing stories about the masked wrestler back in the 19 teens and 1920s, and hearing those stories and really seeing the emergence of lucha libre in the 40s and the 50s, and how when wrestlers start going back to the States and they want more masked wrestlers, they want more identities, they want more personas, and that's one of the things I would absolutely love to have the opportunity to do. But again, when I look at it, and Evan, I think you would agree with me here, and Russ, I think you would agree as well. In professional wrestling, it doesn't matter whether you're a wrestler, a referee, an announcer, a historian. There's always something new you can learn about this industry.
Oh yeah, yeah.
There's always something you can do. And I mean, again, to give you an idea, this past Saturday, I was at an event in my home promotion, Dynamo Pro Wrestling in Barnhart, Missouri. And again, just to let you know here too, and I preface this to the nth degree. In professional wrestling, you have your promotions like your WWE, you have your AEWs, you have your TNAs, you have your New Japans. Don't forget your independents. Don't forget those
We
promotions.
never forget the independents on the show. We talk about it all the time.
Don't forget the independent, because again, having the opportunity and seeing a lot of these great wrestlers who are coming out, and again, it just, I was amazed just a couple weeks ago on the wonderful world of YouTube, and out of nowhere at AAW's last event in the Berwyn Eagles Hall, and out walks Seth Rollins, Tyler Black, for those that are familiar, and having the opportunity of seeing him and saying, hey, I know where I've been. I know where I came from. And again,
That is wonderful.
That having to see that full circle, and again, that's one of the things too, when you sit there and you look at it, there's a lot of great historical pieces. There's a lot of great history that's still out there. You talk about the likes of 350 Days. You talk about the likes of Heroes of World Class. You talk about countless films, and I had a lot of my younger colleagues like, oh, well, I saw The Wrestler. I'm like, and that's true, but can you go back and talk about the wrestlers, like in the set, you talk about like Paradise Alley, among others, and they're sitting there going, what's that? I'm like, go back and watch that.
Well,
Go back and see these things.
That's why you should read my new book, Grindhouse, Odd House, and Wrestling Flicks. We do a deep dive into El Santo and Blue Demon and a lot of the films you're talking about. And we talk about Stallone in there, who had a lot of respect for pro wrestling. And guys like Dick Murdoch, who were huge in St. Louis, he was in Paradise Alley. And I'll tell you a little story that people may not know. You know, the crew on Paradise Alley were a little dismissive of the wrestlers. Oh, you know, that fake stuff. And Stallone told them, you treat these guys with respect, just like the actors on this film, because these guys are great athletes. So Stallone, he gets it. He gets it. And
Well, then he brought Hulk Hogan in for Rocky 3, and the rest was history.
yeah, for better and for worse, but yeah.
Yeah, that is true. And I mean, again, one thing, and just kind of sitting back and looking at it, just food for thought. What happens if Vern cashes in on him? If Vern realizes how big the Rocky 3 motion picture was going to be and what it was going to do eventually for Hulk Hogan's career, does Vince McMahon have somebody in the wings to take that spot that Hulk Hogan ultimately takes? And again, that quick progression from Bob Backlund to the Iron Sheik to Hulk Hogan, does that happen? Does wrestling get to where it is today?
Yes, because I was there, and Sergeant Slaughter as a face was on fire at that time, and he could have done the whole American patriot gimmick.
Or they could have just pushed superstar Billy Graham, in the right way. He was still in his
body
prime.
was breaking down though. But
they could have had a couple of good year run, to get. You didn't need that many years.
Could we have looked at the idea too of maybe putting Jimmy Snuka in that top level?
But Snuka had his problems outside the ring at the time, but Sergeant Slaughter would wrestle Iron Sheik on top at the Garden, and Hogan wouldn't even be on the card. So, Slaughter was a draw back then. I mean, he slowed down a lot by the late 80s, early 90s, but, prime Slaughter was amazing for a big guy, amazing. And
I was a huge fan back then too.
Yeah,
but I think the problem is that Vern was too interested in pushing his son, and
I think it was more he was a purist, and he didn't see Hogan as the champ, because it was always Vern and Nick Bockwinkel, guys who could, like St. Louis, they emphasized more the wrestling end of things. I mean, they had brawlers like Mad Dog Vachon too, but yeah, I just think Vern, what he knew was, Vern and Nick. I mean, and Kurt Anning.
Mm-hmm.
Kurt Anning was a great wrestler. I mean, Zbyszko was champ for a while. Zbyszko could wrestle.
There's another one to look at there too when you start looking at wrestlers along those lines. Even though he was stuck in a tag team, you look at the likes of a Jim Brunzell. You look at the like of, if you go farther down the road, I mean, again, it was more towards the end, but you start looking at wrestlers the likes of maybe a DJ Peterson, maybe a young Scott Hall, maybe the idea of the Patriot.
But they weren't big draws at the time.
But again, it's one of those where they still had the opportunity of where they could potentially build those things. But again, when it comes down to Vern Gagne was as you said, a purist. He knew what he wanted. And again, he did have his brawlers. He had the likes of pretty much whoever was in Sheik Adnan LKC's organization at the time. I mean, again, when you have the likes of Jerry Blackwell, you have Bruiser Brody for a time. And again, he had his cast of characters too. But when it comes down to it, unfortunately, Vern Gagne, he was kind of the odd man out, because at least to a certain degree, the Crockett's kind of knew what was going on, primarily because they knew you had your Flairs, and you had your Dusty Rhodes, and you had your Magnum TAs, and you had your Four Horsemen, and you had your Barry Windhams. And the WWF was capitalizing on all the different promotions, or all the different promotions throughout the country, all the local territories. But Vern really didn't have either of those avenues, and he kind of became the odd man out.
Yeah, I saw the AWA in New Jersey at the Meadowlands, and first they did Pro Wrestling USA with the NWA, but obviously that wasn't going to work. Too many cooks, too many promoters. So then AWA would come in on their own, and they just didn't draw big in this area. I saw Bockwinkel against Zbyszko. That was great. I mean, twice. They ran that twice. And Nick was in his 50s, and he was still, amazing. And I mean, I enjoyed their product, but it wasn't as flashy as what WWF was doing at the time. So, it wasn't going to end well. It didn't end well for them.
So tell us about your involvement in Dynamo Pro Wrestling.
Well, Dynamo Pro Wrestling has been around for a number of years here in the St. Louis area, and ironically, it's when you have great promotions, it seems like when one kind of starts to falter, the next one takes the spot. But the thing was, though, Dynamo Pro Wrestling came out of what was Gateway Championship Wrestling. Gateway Championship Wrestling came out of what was Midwest Renegade Wrestling. And Dynamo Pro Wrestling has been, for better part of 15 years in St. Louis, has been, in the eyes of many, of the measuring stick, or one of the measuring sticks, because when you sit and you look at professional wrestling in Dynamo Pro, there have been so many wrestlers that have had the opportunity to go on to promotions all across the globe. I think of the likes of a gentleman who a lot of people may not be familiar with. It was a man by the name of Dirty Jake Durden, a man who called himself the Intelligent Monster, a man who a lot of people likened to a very young Bruiser Brody. And having the opportunity of seeing him develop and go on to wrestle over in Japan, the likes of watching a team by the name of High Level Enterprise going through between what they did with us and with WLW, moving on to compete in Japan with Pro Wrestling Noah. A matter of fact, there are several right now.
Pro Wrestling Noah, that hits a particular bell. You just rang a particular bell for me, because I was with Pro Wrestling Iron, and we had a deal with Pro Wrestling Noah in the early 2000, in like the 2003 2004 range. So I'm not sure if the guys that you knew worked with some of the guys that I worked with at Pro Wrestling Iron, like Mike Modest, Donovan Morgan, Tony Jones, and Max Justice were all guys that came and wrestled in Noah from here.
And when you look at it too, though, I mean, not only with that, but again, there were a lot of wrestlers in this last generation with Dynamo Pro, being one of the very few training facilities in the St. Louis area. You have the opportunity. Without Dynamo Pro, you don't have the start of Mischief, Daisy Hayes, Matt Seidel, and Delirious. Most recently, Dynamo Pro can lay claim to the likes of starting the careers of several people who've gone on to AEW, the likes of Warhorse. Began his career in Dynamo Pro. A young woman by the name of Rain Victoria, who wrestled during the pandemic for AEW. Another woman who's really setting the world on fire as of late. Some call her Sheen, others know her as Tootie Lynn Ramsey. She's been all around different promotions. She's been in NWA. She's been in, I believe she's had a few matches in ROH, among others. One of the things that makes Dynamo Pro so unique is the idea that it is the starting point for so many people who've come through and been successful in the world of professional wrestling. And again, in my career, it gave me the opportunity. When I first started in Dynamo Pro, I was a referee. Then one night their announcer calls off, okay, here, you go with that. Then it just happened that, true story, had an opportunity. There was a gentleman by the name of TNT Kenny G. Now, a lot of people don't know who TNT Kenny G is, and I wouldn't expect him to know who TNT Kenny G is. But you know his daughter. That is Santana Garrett, a woman who's definitely made her own reputation, made her own niche in the world of professional wrestling. And when TNT Kenny G had a stroke, he came up with the idea of a title, Stroke Ain't No Joke. And being a media guy, being a college educated individual, that drove me up the wall because of the grammar. But at that point, it's like, hey, let's go back and look at and see what pro wrestling can be. Because a lot of people in today's world, they jump on the internet, they jump onto Facebook, they jump onto to Twitter, they jump onto to all these different avenues. I knew back in the day, and my promoter was like, do it. And going in and getting interviews with newspapers, getting interviews with local stations, getting contacts with local colleges. And at that point in time, I mean, again, it just kind of keeps going and having the opportunity to see new people coming in. Gentleman had his third official refereeing match this past weekend and be able to sit back and say, hey, these are the things you've done good. These are going to wind up getting you with a five-knuckle sandwich in the face if you don't watch what you're doing. But, I mean, when you sit there and you look at all the things, I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. And again, that when you sit there and look at it, and it kind of ties into the Hall of Fame, is that the Independent St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame looks at wrestlers that cover the whole gamut. I dare say, the closest thing you're going to get to the true territory days in 2026.
Yeah, so tell us about the. I was just about to go there, so you perfectly fishtailed right into it. So tell us about the Independent St. Louis Hall of Fame.
Well, the Independent St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame was actually started in April of 2018, and the first two inductees to the Hall of Fame were two men who worked together, and they've already been mentioned here thus far. One was the man who's now the late Tony Costa, who ran the Mid-Missouri Wrestling Alliance, and SICW's Herb Simmons, who's gone on to so many great things in the world of professional wrestling. Matter of fact, he is a part of the Cauliflower Alley Club, and among other things. But as time has gone on with the Independent St. Louis
his most famous achievement was being on this show.
Very,
I think he
very well
put that
might
top of his resume. I'm sure he put that at the very top of his resume, is being on Wrestling and Everything Coast to Coast. Everything else is just fluff after that. But continue.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, again, to give you the idea of when you're looking at things for the Hall of Fame, and at this point, the one thing that really stands out with the Independent St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame is these are men and women both who are a part of the board of directors who sit down and they look at all these different promotions. Because as crazy as it sounds, in St. Louis today, even back when I first started wrestling, there were three promotions. You had MMWA, you had SICW, and you had a company by the name of RCW. Those were the three. And then about the mid-90s, whenever things started really blowing up, that's when you had promotions like an MRW. You had promotions like a Dynamo Pro Wrestling. You had promotions like the MVWA. You had promotions like Midwest Powerhouse Wrestling. You had promotions like WLW back when it was World League Wrestling, or World Legion Wrestling, not World League Wrestling. And as time goes on, we look at the individuals who have been inducted into the class, just kind of going through some of them here, looking at, and again, if you want to see all of them, make it a point, check out istlwhof.com. But when you sit here and look at it, you have the likes of the legendary Big Daddy. Now, this isn't the Big Daddy that many people are familiar with when you look at European wrestling. This was a gentleman who just recently, a matter of fact, in the last couple of weeks, passed away here in the St. Louis area. This was a man in the 80s who, I mean, he was one of those. He would come to the ring. He'd have the feather earring. He'd wear the obnoxious pink suit. He had the sequin beret. He'd come to the ring with a lot of times would be with his cane that was often bedazzled or sequined or whatever. But it was one of those where he came out there, and when he got out there, you knew full well that people were going to be intimidated by the man. But, I mean, when you sit and you look at some of the other inductees, you had the likes of Cora Combs, an individual who a lot of people don't necessarily give her due in this day and age. You have the likes of the Hebner brothers. You have the likes of a gentleman by the name of Dr. Blood, who, for many historians, you might think, oh, well, Dr. Blood, who's that? Many people knew him by other monikers of Wayne St. Wayne. Another name that your viewers might know is a gentleman.
Luke, Wayne St. Wayne was a dear friend of mine, and I have a great Wayne St. Wayne story. This is a true story. He comes to New York on vacation, and I said, listen, man, we got to get together, because he used to contribute to my old newsletter, Wrestling Then and Now. So, and he would draw the covers for my old newsletter, and I said, let's get together. He says, I'm going to be painting outdoors at the
Mhm.
Ohio Players concert. And this was back in the 80s, and they were still pretty hot at the time. I said, Wayne, there's going to be thousands of people there. How are we going to find each other? This was pre-cell phones and the whole deal. He
Mhm.
says, don't worry, you'll find me. This was his way of saying, I'm not a 9 to 5er. I don't set my schedule. I don't have a clock like most people. And I did find him because he had a big easel and he was painting in the middle of this concert with thousands of people outdoors, this free concert. And he was colorful. And in my previous book, Wrestling Rings, Blackboards, and Movie Sets, I have a whole chapter on Wayne St. Wayne. I love that guy because this guy, like to the beat of his own drummer, he would just paint all.
Mhm.
He would paint all day in these St. Louis, bars and clubs, and that was how he made a living. And he was a single dad raising kids, as an artist, which is not an easy thing to do. He never made any kind of big money in wrestling, but yeah, he wrestled as Dr. Blood, Buddy Frankenstein. I knew him well.
Mhm.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, good
And, and,
guy.
and one of the things I always remembered when I was growing up in the wrestling industry, my brother, again, prime example, Mangia Italiano, a restaurant here in the St.
Yeah, yeah,
Louis
yeah, yeah,
area
yeah.
that Dr. Blood
Absolutely.
would paint at. And he actually, for many, many years, had a painting of Dr. Blood's. And the title in itself would kind of give you the story of Dr. Blood. The title was Yet Another Self Portrait Done Without a Mirror. That's a Wayne St. Wayne. That's a Dr. Blood right there. And
Wayne
his rep-
Wayne would drop acid and paint. So he would have these paintings of like Dick the Bruiser in the ring, and there were like 2.5 ropes, and it was all like fuzzy because he was on acid as he was painting. This guy was colorful, believe me. He passed away a few years ago. I don't know if you know. Yeah, yeah.
and there was one too I remember, and actually is a very good friend of mine who's still in the wrestling industry to this day had one, and it was a print. And all I'm gonna say is this: Dick the Bruiser and an alien spaceship. I gotta make
Yeah,
sure I
yeah,
find
yeah.
a
This is
copy of
kind of
that print.
he'd be on acid and he'd come up with this crazy stuff, and like the wrestlers, they look kind of off in the paintings because that was the way he was seeing them at the time. But yeah,
Are you sure he was seeing them?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Guys, pull up, Google Wayne St. Wayne. Trust me, it's worth the trip because this guy was colorful. He was one of a kind. Recently, I saw a piece on a guy that reminds me of Wayne, the Cosmic Commander of Wrestling. And I knew this guy. He was an indie heel manager, and he was also a punk rocker, and he paid the bills as a tattoo artist. Okay, so this guy was not a 9 to 5er either. And he would come up to our old radio show 3 in the morning, and this guy was colorful, and we used to call him Cosmo, the Cosmic Commander of Wrestling. He was kind of doing like a Grand Wizard of Wrestling takeoff, but yeah, man, it's easy. I shouldn't say easy. Easy is the wrong word. Most people are 9 to 5ers in some miserable soul killing job. 4 out of 5 Americans hate their jobs. So I have nothing but respect for the Wayne St. Waynes and the Cosmic Commanders of Wrestling who take a different path and, follow their muse as hard as it may be. Yeah, I mean, these guys, they're one of a kind, and long after they're gone, they're remembered. We did an entire tribute show to Johnny Legend. He was another guy like that. Johnny Legend wasn't cut out to work in an office, believe me.
Very,
So who
very
else?
true, Evan.
Who are the other nominees for the Hall of Fame?
Well, this year's class of the 2026 Hall of Fame really is a very wide variety of professional wrestling personalities. The top one off the list is a gentleman by the name of Steve Montana. Here it's a guy spends 34 years in the professional wrestling industry, wrestles for countless championships. You name it, he's done it in the wrestling industry. Most people at 30 plus years, you figure, oh well, he's going to go to that 9 to 5 job. He's going to do this, that, and the whatnot. Man, right now is actually a regular, and he's actually presently a member of the Screen Actors Guild. He's performed in several movies, and he's taken his professional wrestling experience and he's moved it on to the world of professional acting. You have Black Glove Butch Fletcher, another one like a Johnny Legend. Here's a guy who in the 80s was coming out in a suit that would make Jim Carrey and Dumb and Dumber cringe. But I mean, again, he was the one. He came out with that one black glove, and you knew, kind of like Ted DiBiase back in the Mid-South days, or the Blackjacks. If they popped you with that glove, you knew it was trouble. And actually, to get an opportunity, and I have to see if I can pull it up here on the web, he had an opportunity back in the mid '90s to manage a gentleman by the name of Angus King. And without Angus King, you don't have Kane. So again, you look at how the connections are there. And next one, gentleman by the name of the Beast, 36 years in professional wrestling against the likes of everybody that's anybody. And to give you an idea, back in '97, he had an opportunity in the MVWA. He picked a fight with a gentleman by the name of Mabel. And I had never seen anybody pick up the Beast. Beast is about 350, 375. And Mabel just picked him up, held him there, boom. And the bad news was, though, he was too close to the stationary camera. And you could see the camera shake for about the next 3 minutes because it was just that much body mass being moved. But again, the Beast going in this year, every lady's fantasy Marcus Mansfield, a gentleman who I really have a lot to be thankful for because he actually gave me an opportunity. I was a little kid when I first started wrestling, and he pulled me aside one day, and this was right about the time he started working with Kane, and he's like, "You want to impress your friends?" "Yeah, sure, why not? Here, take this for a couple days." He had a retired championship belt, and he let me take it to high school. And show my friends and show them, hey, this is what I'm fighting for. This is what I'm doing. This is what I'm wanting to achieve. Everybody took me seriously after that. I will forever be thankful to him. And again, a man who passed away, he had I believe it was a form of brain cancer.
Yeah.
And when it happened, he still kept going. He still kept doing everything he could to try to fight the disease, and he passed away in 2021. He's a man who, I mean, everybody would tell you Marcus Mansfield was a man's man in every shape and stretch of the word. Another one you look at.
It's good that you are doing this to honor these guys because it's a shame that some of these indie guys devote so much of their life to pro wrestling. They're not financially being compensated what they should be. They have all kinds of injuries and pain. I've had indie wrestler friends tell me I'm always in pain, multiple surgeries and concussions. So, you guys doing this is really special because to them and their families and their friends and their fans, it's meaningful. And WWE putting in the Undertaker's wife or Booker T's wife, it's like the nepotism wing of the WWE Hall of Fame. What you guys are doing is from the heart. It's from the heart, really.
And when you look at it too, I mean, again, another one, a gentleman by the name of Big Bad Ben. Without a Big Bad Ben, there's not an MRW. Without
I saw
an
his
MRW,
clock in England. It was great. No, that's a poor joke.
But no, Big Bad Ben was one of those where without an MRW, there's not a Gateway Championship Wrestling. Without a Gateway Championship Wrestling, there's not a Dynamo Pro. He was one of those, and I talked to a good friend of mine, Jeremy Lightfoot, fellow inductee last year, and he's like, he made St. Louis have that ECW style. He gave people the opportunity who weren't going to get a chance in a lot of these other promotions. He gave them the chance. For some of these guys who had been in wrestling 10, 12, 15 years, it was the shot in the arm to make them relevant again. And again, he did.
Let me tell you, let me tell you a quick St. Louis story before we run out of time. 1992, Dr. Mike Lano, regular on the show, does a tribute to Sam Muchnick, and I helped them do this. And Sam at the time was very old and sick, and he couldn't make his own tribute. But there was Bob Backlund. Bob Backlund, Lou Thez. That's how I met Lanny Poffo, who became a dear friend. Tiger Conway Jr. and Sr., Killer Kowalski. I tell a story in my book. Killer Kowalski at the Sam Muchnick tribute gets on the podium. He's talking about during the Jim Crow era, sneaking Woody Strode into hotels back in the Jim Crow South, and he started crying. And I look around and you have all these tough guys, Rip Hawk, these old school tough wrestlers there, Ernie Ladd, and they're crying, It was very, really said something about the wrestling industry, the brotherhood, Kowalski, they were breaking the law to, take care of their brother. They wouldn't let the guy sleep in the hotel with them back in the day. And, it was a beautiful event. The Sam Muchnick tribute convention. DiBiase was there. All these guys flew themselves in. They weren't paid. It wasn't like this was before all the autograph conventions. It wasn't an appearance to sign autographs. They flew themselves in to pay tribute to Sam Muchnick, and that says everything. Believe me. I mean, you couldn't find that today. Not too many guys would do that. You have famous wrestlers who die and there's nobody at the funeral. It's different mentality today.
Well, Evan, you bring up a real good point too. What makes the Independent St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame so unique as well is the idea of where the last three individuals going in this year aren't necessarily wrestlers, but they're people who have been a part of professional wrestling in some form or another. We have what's called the Pete Parisi Award, a man who was known as a pioneer in the broadcast era of local independent St. Louis wrestling. And the gentleman who's being inducted in that is a gentleman by the name of Tom Simon, who has been all over the country. I mean, I could be remiss if I could find a promotion he hasn't worked for in nearly 30 years. Another thing this year, we have two inductees under the President's Award. One of them is the late Johnny Ramirez. For those that are familiar in St. Louis and the Central States area, accomplished referee and wrestler, wrestling the likes of Big Bill Miller, Sonny Myers, Pat O'Connor, Bob Geigel, Joe Blanchard, among others. And the other one, which holds a lot of merit to me, is a gentleman by the name of Keon Option. Here's a guy who, I mean, it just amazes me what he did. He unfortunately passed away at the age of 30. But the thing was, though, is it wasn't because of anything that was bad. It was just fate. I mean, here's a guy who competed for pretty much every promotion in the immediate area, former Dynamo Pro champion, wrestled in and there's nobody that could say a bad word about this guy. And just as good as he was in the ring, again, just going back and doing the history, bachelor's degree in psychology, master's degree in public administration. He was a member of the Army National Guard's Officer Candidate Program, former president of the NWACP in college, founder of national founder and fraternity president of Alpha Omega Theta Christian Fraternity, ran for the House of Representatives. And I mean, again, when you have somebody who gave so much to people, and I mean, it's like you said, attending his funeral, and there were probably 30 wrestlers there, and they were all crying like little babies. And I mean, having the opportunity, and that's like I said, this year I have the honor and privilege to be the one inducting Keon Option into the Hall of Fame. And I'm going to tell you right now, I talked to my promoter this past weekend, and I said, I would be amazed. And I mean, again, I've been around wrestling for nearly 40 years. I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep it together to do this man justice. And that's one of the things that really stands out to me. When you talk about
it's real.
You talk about the Independent St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame. These are the men and women who are going out, day in, day out. And I use an analogy here, just like our broadcast colleague Evan says in 350 days. The time you spend on the road, these men and women become family. And that's exactly what we're trying to acknowledge here with the Independent St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame. And I'm going to tell you, anybody in the St. Louis area, Sunday afternoon, July 19th, if you have the opportunity to be in the St. Louis area, come check it out. You hear the stories, you hear the legends, you hear all the
My
things.
birthday.
That,
You can also
that's
celebrate
it right
Buddy's
there.
birthday.
San Francisco, you can get a flight. You can be here in 2.5, 3 hours. You'll lose some time coming, or actually you'd be losing some time coming to St. Louis. But I'm going to tell you this, you make it a point to show up. It's going to be a great night. Opportunity too, you get a meal, you get to hear all the great stories, and it's going to be a good time had by one and all. And again, if you're in the St. Louis area, make it a point, check us out. If you're online, istlwhof.com. We're going to have, as a matter of fact, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to have bios of all the inductees for 2026. And again, gentlemen, when you talk professional wrestling, St. Louis is a place to be, and to represent the Independent St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame is one of the biggest honors in my career. And being able to share some time with you guys tonight, talking pro wrestling, talking the history of the sport, and to quote Shane Douglas, of the sport of professional wrestling. That's why I love what I do.
That's fantastic. Can you give our fans a way to contact you socially, social media?
Social media, you can go online and you can pull me up. You can search Luke Roberts, or you can search referee Luke Roberts. You can catch me on social media through the Independent St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame. We do have a Facebook and a Twitter account. Also, if you go to the website, it will also send you directly. There's a link. You can pull the email and it will send it directly to the board of directors as well. If you need more information, more about the history, if you want to know more about St. Louis professional wrestling, the Independent St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame is your one-stop shop.
Fantastic. That is a great interview. Really love to have you on the show, especially if you have anything else to promote for yourself or Dynamo Pro or the Hall of Fame. We love to help help promote it, and hopefully have you on the show again really soon. Really appreciate your contributions for tonight.
All right. Well, again, gentlemen, thank you very much. And as I want to show one last thing before we go, this is the staple of the professional wrestling scene in St. Louis. All of our inductees have had the opportunity. And if you notice, when we talk about the territorial days, if you look at all these side plates, this isn't just one promotion. It isn't two. That right there showcases 32 promotions in the past 50 years. That's tradition. That's pro wrestling. That's lineage. That's the Independent St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame.
And that's the show tonight. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.